Hi, third grade. This week in grammar, we are going to take a step back and review some of the skills that we've been learning this quarter three in grammar. So, the first thing that we talked about this quarter were comparatives and superlatives. So, remember, some adjectives and adverbs compare two or more things. These are called comparatives and superlatives. Can you think of some examples? Well, hopefully you remember that comparatives compare two things, and those end with that suffix er. So if I were to say, Mrs. Nowicki is faster than me, I would use the comparative faster. But if I were to say Mrs. Menz is the fastest of all the third grade teachers, I would use the superlative fastest with that est ending. So, really quickly, let's just review that when you're using the comparative, that's when you're comparing two things. And when you're comparing two things using a one-syllable word, you use that suffix er, like faster than. Okay. If the word is more than one syllable, like fast was one syllable, so we just added the er. But if it's more than one syllable, you have to add the word more or less in front of it. For example, more helpful than or less helpful than. It doesn't make sense to say more or helpfuler. Okay. And then lastly, the rule for comparatives is if that word ends with a Y, you have to drop the Y and then add IER. So happier than. Okay. And then on the right side there, you have some rules for those superlatives that you use. Remember, you use a superlative when you're comparing more than two things. So if you are saying, that again, Mrs. Menz is the fastest of all the third grade teachers, you would use that suffix est at the end. But again, if it's more than one syllable, like the word helpful, instead of saying more or less, you would say, Mrs. Graper is the most helpful friend. Okay. And then lastly, if your word like happy ends in the letter Y, then you have to drop the Y and add IEST. So Miss Fidazzo is the happiest when her students listen. Okay, so those are just some rules to refresh your memory on comparatives and superlatives. Remember, comparatives always, always, always are followed by that word than to compare. Just like in math, when you're comparing numbers, it's greater than or less than. And the superlatives always, always, always are behind the word, they follow the word the. Okay, so that was a trick we talked about earlier this quarter. Let's take a look at some examples. My bedroom is blank than my brother's. Okay, so here you're comparing two bedrooms. So I think we need to use the comparative here, right? And another clue that you need to know to use the comparative is that word than is after it. So we want to say my bedroom is smaller than my brother's. The middle sentence says, a kitten is blank than a cat. Here we go again. We need to use a comparative because we're comparing two things, a kitten compared to a cat. And there's that keyword than. But look at the word in parentheses. It's energetic. That's 4 syllables. So it's not grammatically correct to say a kitten is energeticer, oh boy, than a cat. We need to use those words more or less. But from experience, I know that a kitten is more energetic than a cat. Lastly, it says, she is the blank person that I've ever met. So here, we're not using a comparative because we're comparing one person to all of the other people that we've met. And there's that keyword the right before it. So the word is funny. It ends with a Y. So remember the rule when you're using a superlative that ends with a Y, drop the Y and add IEST. So it's she is the funniest person that I've ever met. Okay, moving on to the next skill that we talked about this quarter in grammar is the fact that a subject and the verb in your sentence must work together to agree and sound good when you're speaking and when you're writing. So if the subject is singular, like look down below, it's the boy, it's one boy, then you will add an S to the action verb. The boy plays video games, not the boy play video games. The second rule to remember is if that subject is plural. So this time, look down below in blue, it's the boys. That's plural, more than one. This time, if it's plural, you do not add an S to the action verb. So it makes sense to say the boys play video games. Now, don't forget about those rule breakers we talked about. The pronouns I and you are both singular pronouns or singular subjects, but you do not add the S to the action verb when you use those pronouns in your writing and in your speaking. You play video games, not you plays video games. Just doesn't sound right. So quick review here. Let's see, which verb agrees with the subject? Well, our subject here is Grace. Grace blank a sandwich every day. Well, is it Grace eats a sandwich or Grace eats a sandwich? Ask yourself, is your subject singular or plural? Definitely Grace is one person, so it's singular. That means you typically add an S to the action verb. Grace eats a sandwich every day. And the last topic that we're going to review together today is pronoun and antecedent agreement. Remember, a pronoun replaces or refers to a noun. This noun is called the antecedent, and they must agree when you're writing or speaking. So in our sentence here, it says, Noah puts on his shoes. Noah is the noun. That's our antecedent. But later on in the sentence, it says, Noah puts on his shoes. That pronoun there is referring back to our antecedent, Noah. And you have to make sure that you use the correct pronoun that matches that. It doesn't make sense to say Noah puts on its shoes or Noah puts on we shoes. Those are pronouns, but they just don't align with the antecedent. So try this example. Faith and I. Okay, that's our noun. Watched the movie blank. Loved it. Okay, Faith and I watched the movie blank. Loved it. Well, Faith and I, does that go with us loved it, we loved it, or they loved it? You might think, well, they makes sense. You could write the sentence, they loved it. But if you look back to those pronouns, Faith and I, it's we, because you're included in that. We loved it. Thank you so much for joining me this week. We will also do some more reviewing next week with other skills that we talked about in quarter 3.